You paid $10,000 for a hole? Warren laughed. Nolan said nothing. Rook stared past him toward the southern ridge, ears stiff, nose testing air no one else could smell. There's no fire, Warren said. You're seeing danger where none exists. Nolan looked at the dry pines, the empty sky, and the deer running downhill in daylight. Then why is everything leaving? Hours later, the roads closed, ash-covered Juniper Ridge, and the same people who mocked his cave were pounding on its door. But when Nolan let them inside, the air monitor began climbing. The shelter saving them was slowly turning into a trap. Nolan Pierce first saw the cave beneath a hard August sun, when the Colorado foothills had gone the color of old rope, and every gust carried the dry scent of pine needles and dust. He stood beside his faded pickup with one hand resting on the open door, while Rook, his 6-year-old German shepherd, studied the slope ahead with the quiet seriousness of a dog who never wasted movement. The property climbed 16 rocky acres above Juniper Ridge, too steep for farming, too dry for grazing, and too far from the nearest power line to interest anyone who wanted an easy life. At the top of the slope, the cave opened in the mountain like a dark, patient mouth. Nolan had paid $10,000 for the land at a county tax auction 3 weeks earlier. The listing called it undeveloped acreage with limited access. The photographs showed scrub oak, broken fencing, and a shadow beneath the ridge that most bidders assumed was nothing more than a shallow hollow. Nolan had driven out before the auction. He had measured the entrance, checked the elevation, watched the afternoon wind move across the slope, and noticed how cool air breathed from the darkness even when the valley shimmered with heat. He had not seen a hole in the mountain. He had seen thick stone, natural insulation, and a structure that had already survived longer than anything people had built below it. Rook jumped down from the truck and began his inspection. He moved along the gravel, nose low, then climbed toward the cave without waiting for a command. Nolan followed with a duffel over one shoulder and a metal case in his right hand. Inside the case were air quality meters, a headlamp, marking chalk, a first aid kit, and the compact tools he trusted more than promises. By noon, word had already spread through town. 3 men stood near the old cattle gate at the bottom of the property, watching Nolan unload water containers, a folding cot, solar batteries, a camp stove, and several sealed bins. Warren Cole, a local real estate broker with silver sunglasses and a voice built for public rooms, called up the slope. "Pierce, tell me you didn't pay 10 grand to sleep with bats." The other men laughed, not loudly, not cruelly enough to admit cruelty. Their laughter carried the softer edge of dismissal, the sound people made when they had already decided another man's life required no understanding. Nolan set down a water container and looked toward them. Warren spread his hands. "There's still time to admit the county fooled you." Rook stopped beside Nolan, ears forward, body still. Nolan touched 2 fingers to the dog's shoulder. The tension left Rook's stance, but his eyes remained on the men below. "The county sold land," Nolan said. "I bought it." Warren tilted his head toward the cave. "That isn't a home." Nolan looked back at the mountain. Heat rolled across the valley, bending the distant roofs of Juniper Ridge into wavering shapes. "I didn't buy a home," he said. "I bought a place that can stand when other things don't." Warren gave a short laugh, but it came slower this time. Nolan carried the rest of his equipment uphill. He had learned years ago that some people asked questions only to defend the answer they already preferred. Arguing with them gave their judgment more weight than it deserved. Inside the cave, the air changed at once. The heat loosened its grip. Sound softened. The main chamber stretched nearly 40 feet before narrowing into a darker passage, partly blocked by collapsed boards and packed earth. Nolan switched on his meter and waited for the readings to settle. Oxygen normal. Carbon monoxide absent. Carbon dioxide slightly elevated near the rear wall, but not dangerous. He marked the spot with white chalk. Rook moved along the stone perimeter, sniffing cracks, old leaves, and dry animal tracks. Near the western passage, he stopped, his tail lowered. He did not growl. He simply stared into the black space beyond the rotted boards. Nolan noticed a strip of damp earth beneath Rook's paws. Everything around it was dry. He crouched, pressed 2 fingers into the soil, and felt cool moisture. "You found something," he murmured. Rook glanced back, then returned his attention to the passage. By late afternoon, Nolan had set the cot near the eastern wall, far from the damp ground. He placed the stove beneath a natural vent, secured food inside hard containers, and ran a temporary solar line to the entrance. Each task followed a familiar order: air, water, shelter, fire, exit. The sequence had once kept other men alive. Now it gave shape to hours that might otherwise drift toward memories he had no wish to revisit. As sunlight thinned across the cave mouth, Rook settled near the entrance, where he could watch both Nolan and the slope below. Nolan sat on an overturned storage bin and listened to the mountain cool. Small cracks moved through the stone. Wind brushed the scrub outside. Somewhere down in town, a truck engine faded along the county road. Then came another sound, faint, regular, metallic. It echoed from behind the blocked western passage. Tap, silence, tap. Nolan lifted his head. Rook was already standing. The dog moved between Nolan and the darkness, muscles tight beneath his coat. The sound came again. Metal touching stone with the patience of something that had been waiting a long time to be heard. Nolan reached for his headlamp but did not approach. Not yet. He rested a hand against Rook's neck and felt the dog's steady pulse beneath his palm. "Tomorrow," Nolan said quietly, "we learn what this place really is." At first light, Nolan woke to Rook standing beside the western passage, ears fixed on the boards that blocked it. The tapping had stopped before midnight, but the dog had never fully settled. Nolan checked the air monitor. Oxygen normal. Carbon monoxide absent. Carbon dioxide stable. He clipped a safety line to his harness. "Slow and clean," he told Rook. Nolan removed the boards one at a time. Behind them lay a narrow corridor shaped partly by nature and partly by tools. Pick marks scored the limestone. Rusted brackets lined one wall, and a steel pipe disappeared into the dark. The metallic sound returned when morning wind reached the cave. A loose valve tapped against the pipe. Nolan tightened it with a wrench. The noise stopped. One mystery solved, another opened. Someone had built here. For the first time since arriving, Nolan felt the cave offering an answer and a warning in the same breath to them both. Rook moved forward only after Nolan tested the air. They found a concrete tank sunk into the floor. Beyond it stood metal shelving, a collapsed workbench, and an old ventilation fan. Faded lettering showed through the dust. Ridge Storges Project, 1974. Nolan brushed the words with his glove. County records mentioned none of it. Rook crossed to the far wall and pressed his nose against a seam behind the tank. Cool air touched Nolan's hand when he crouched beside him. There was space beyond the stone, perhaps another chamber. He marked the seam but left it untouched. Breaking rock without knowing what supported it was how shelters became graves. By mid-morning, Nolan had mapped the corridor and traced the pipe to a vertical vent climbing toward the ridge. Warm air could escape above while cooler air entered below. Rust had eaten through two supports. Dust clogged the fan housing. Dead leaves filled the lower vent. He cleared debris, fitted mesh over openings, and separated the sleeping area from the stove. Rook shadowed him, sometimes inspecting the passage, sometimes touching Nolan's hand with his nose. Near noon, a county SUV arrived. A woman in a tan work shirt climbed the slope carrying a clipboard and hard hat. "Mara Ellison," she said, county fire engineer. Her gaze moved across the solar panels, marked exits and air monitor. Someone reported an unpermitted residence. "Warren Cole?" Nolan asked. One corner of her mouth moved. The report was anonymous in the way small towns define anonymous. Nolan handed her his readings, sketch, and inspection notes. Mara read in silence. Her expression changed not to approval but attention. "You did all this since yesterday?" "Most of it." She checked the vent, tank, supports, and damp area. "This cannot legally function as a residence yet," she said. "But it is safer than I expected. That is a low bar. Still a bar." She gave him 30 days to complete a structural review, add alarms, and prove there were 2 usable exits. Before leaving, Mara stopped at the entrance and looked south. "Fire season came early," she said. "There is a burn 40 miles out, but crews think it will stay east." Rook rose at once. His nose lifted toward the southern ridge. He inhaled twice, then stood rigid. The air smelled clean to Mara. To Nolan, something faint moved beneath the dust. Heated resin, old ash. "He smells smoke," Nolan said. Mara studied the empty sky. "I don't." Nolan kept his eyes on Rook. "Not yet." 3 days later, Juniper Ridge felt baked hollow. The grass along the county road had faded from yellow to gray, and the pine needles snapped beneath Nolan's boots like dry matchsticks. By 10 in the morning, heat shimmered over the roofs in town. The official forecast promised another clear day. Rook did not believe it. The German shepherd had spent most of dawn near the cave entrance, nose raised toward the southern ridge, breathing in short, deliberate pulls. He refused breakfast until Nolan carried the bowl inside. "You know something," Nolan said. Rook looked toward the trees. Nolan had learned not to dismiss instincts simply because they arrived without words. He walked the property line with a handheld weather meter, checking temperature, humidity, and wind direction. The lower wind moved east, but the tops of the pines leaned north. 2 layers of air were crossing above the valley. He wrote the readings in a small notebook. On the return path, he noticed the birds were gone. Juniper Ridge was rarely quiet in August. Jays usually fought in the scrub oak, and crows gathered around the road by noon. That morning, branches stood empty. Near the creek bed, 3 mule deer moved downhill in full daylight, heads low and steps quick. They passed within 20 yards of Nolan without slowing. Rook watched them disappear toward town. "They're leaving high ground," Nolan murmured. The air carried a faint bitterness now, not enough to call smoke, but enough to coat the back of his throat. He drove into town for supplies. At the hardware store, he loaded 2 cases of bottled water, N95 masks, furnace filters, spare batteries, eye wash, fire blankets, and another carbon monoxide alarm. Warren Cole spotted him near the register. "Building an ark now?" Warren asked. 2 men beside him laughed. Nolan kept placing supplies on the counter. "You clear the brush around your house?" Warren leaned against a display of garden tools. "My house has sprinklers. Sprinklers fail when power does. I've got a generator." "How much fuel?" Warren's smile tightened. "Enough. Second way out?" Nolan asked. "Pierce, relax. The fire is 40 miles away." Nolan looked at him. "Distance matters less than wind." Warren shook his head. "You veterans see threats everywhere." Nolan felt the old pressure gather behind his ribs, small but familiar. He did not answer from it. He paid and carried the boxes outside. Rook waited in the truck, alert and still. Mara Ellison called before Nolan left the parking lot. She confirmed the wildfire had grown overnight but remained outside the county line. Crews expected containment by evening. Nolan asked whether they had modeled Cedar Run. "Why?" she said. "The canyon faces southwest. If the upper wind shifts, it funnels straight into town." A brief silence followed. "Send me your readings," Mara said. Nolan emailed the notes and drove to the overlook above Juniper Ridge. From there, the southern horizon appeared washed in pale yellow. No flames, no visible column of smoke, just a thin discoloration spreading behind the hills. Rook stood in the truck bed and stared south. Nolan studied the terrain. Cedar Run cut through the mountains like a narrow throat, lined with deadfall and drought-stressed pine. Wind entering that canyon would accelerate. Fire would do the same. At the cave, Nolan moved supplies into sealed bins and cleared another 30 feet of brush from the entrance. He tested the old ventilation shaft, checked the solar batteries, and placed masks near the door. He also filled 6 water containers, though the work made sweat run down his back. Near sunset, Mara arrived in her county SUV. She carried a tablet showing a fire map. "The command team says your scenario is unlikely," she said. Nolan studied the red perimeter. "Unlikely isn't impossible." "I know." She glanced toward the valley. "They won't issue an evacuation based on 1 wind reading." Nolan handed her his notebook. "Then use the animals, no birds, deer moving downhill." Smoke scent before the visible plume. Mara's expression tightened. "Animals aren't evidence I can put in an order." "No," Nolan said. "They're evidence you investigate before the order becomes late." Rook suddenly stood, ears high. He gave 3 short barks, the trained signal for a detected hazard. Nolan turned south. A narrow orange line had appeared behind the ridge, faint but unmistakable. Mara's tablet still showed the fire moving east. Her phone had no emergency alert. The wind touched the cave entrance, hotter than before, carrying ash too fine to see. Nolan looked at Mara. It changed direction. By midnight, the glow behind the southern ridge had widened into a red smear. Wind moved through Juniper Ridge in hard, uneven bursts, hot enough to feel wrong against the skin. Ash began to fall before the first official evacuation alert reached Nolan's phone. The message arrived in fragments, delayed by an overloaded network, warning residents south of Cedar Run to leave immediately. 10 minutes later, the eastern highway closed after a fallen tree blocked both lanes. Mara stood beside her county SUV, listening to overlapping voices on the radio. "The main shelter is moving north," she said. Smoke reached the school gym faster than expected. Nolan looked down at the town, porch lights blinked on one by one. Headlights gathered along the western road, then stopped. "Traffic?" he asked. Mara nodded. "A truck overheated near the bridge. They're trying to clear it." Rook paced at the cave entrance, ears shifting with every distant engine and siren. Nolan moved quickly. He sealed the unused vents, placed wet cloth around the lower frame, and started the filtration fan. He set masks, water, and medical supplies near the main chamber. "This place isn't certified for public use," Mara reminded him. "I know. If people come, we monitor the air every 15 minutes. Nolan met her eyes. "If people come, we don't leave them outside." Mara held his gaze for a moment, then handed him a spare radio. Channel 6. She drove back toward town before the road vanished behind smoke. Nolan had just finished marking a clear path inside when Rook froze. The dog turned toward the lower trail, gave one sharp bark, and ran downhill. "Rook," Nolan followed, grabbing a mask and water bottle. The smoke thickened close to the ground, blurring the scrub and stinging his eyes. Rook disappeared around the bend, then barked again. Nolan found Hank Doyle beside an old pickup pulled halfway off the road. The hardware store owner sat against the front tire, one hand pressed to his chest, face gray beneath a layer of ash. "Truck died," Hank managed. "Thought I could walk." Nolan knelt and fitted the mask over his face, slow breaths. Hank tried to stand, but his knees folded. Nolan took his arm while Rook pressed against Hank's other side, steadying him as they climbed. Inside the cave, Nolan washed Hank's eyes, checked his pulse, and placed him near the filtered air. Hank looked toward the stone walls as if seeing them for the first time. "I laughed at this place," he said. Nolan handed him water. "Breathe first. Talk later." Less than 20 minutes passed before headlights appeared at the property gate. Linda Shaw, the town's postmaster, arrived in a sedan with a cracked windshield. Behind her came Dean Foster, an electrician whose route west had closed after he turned back for medication left at home. Nolan said nothing about the decision. Dean's face already carried enough regret. He logged their names, arrival times, symptoms, and any medical needs. "Why write all that down?" Linda asked. "So rescue crews don't search for people already here," Nolan said. "And so we notice if someone's condition changes." Rook moved between them, checking each newcomer before returning to the entrance. Outside, the sky had lost its stars. The orange glow pulsed behind the smoke, brighter now. Mara's voice broke through the radio. "Nolan, Cedar Run is fully involved. The western route may close. How long until crews reach the ridge? Unknown." Static swallowed the rest. Hank lowered his cup. "Are we trapped?" Nolan looked at the air monitor before answering. "We're sheltered. That's different." The words steadied the room, though Nolan felt the weight behind them. Shelter only remained shelter while air, water, and exits held. He checked the main vent. The reading had changed. Carbon monoxide remained low, but it was climbing by small, steady increments. Nolan frowned and moved the monitor closer to the entrance. The level there was cleaner. He walked toward the western passage. With every step, the number rose. Rook followed, then stopped beside the old concrete tank and stared at the sealed corridor beyond it. A thin gray thread slipped through a crack near the floor. Nolan crouched and touched the stone. Warm air breathed against his fingers. The fire had not reached the cave, but smoke had found the old ventilation system. He looked back at the people gathered near the light. The place that had saved them could still become a trap. Nolan watched the monitor climb another point, then another. The numbers were still below the danger threshold, but they were moving in the wrong direction. That mattered more than the number itself. "Everyone stay near the main entrance," he said. "Keep the masks on." Hank shifted uneasily beside the filter fan. "Is the cave filling with smoke?" "Not yet," Nolan answered. "I'm going to keep it that way." He carried the monitor into the western corridor. Rook stayed at his left knee, nose low, testing the air ahead. The thin ribbon of smoke near the concrete tank had thickened enough to blur the beam of Nolan's headlamp. The old ventilation shaft was pulling dirty air from the southern slope and feeding it into the cave. Closing it completely would stop the smoke, but it would also reduce oxygen and trap heat. Nolan needed controlled airflow, not a sealed box. He returned to the main chamber and looked at the people waiting for him. Their fear showed differently. Linda rubbed her thumb across the edge of her mask. Dean kept glancing toward the exit, as though measuring whether he could outrun the smoke outside. Hank stared into his cup, shoulders rounded beneath the weight of what he had once dismissed. Nolan spread the cave sketch across a storage bin. We have a leak in the west shaft, he said. We can block the contaminated air, but we need to preserve the clean intake near the entrance. Dean stepped closer. What do you need? Power status first. Dean checked the battery display, 72%. Solar input is falling. The smoke outside had turned daylight into a dull copper haze, cutting the panel's output almost in half. Nolan calculated quickly. At the current load, how long can the fan run? 14 hours, maybe less if the motor heats up. Linda looked at the water containers. And the water? 2 days if no one wastes it, Nolan said. He assigned tasks without raising his voice. Dean would monitor the batteries and fan temperature. Linda would record water use, symptoms, and air readings. Hank would cut spare furnace filters to fit a temporary frame. Nobody argued. Fear had stripped away the need to appear certain. Nolan took a fire blanket, a roll of foil tape, 2 filters, and a shallow pan of damp soil. Rook followed him back toward the tank. As they moved deeper, the monitor beeped once. Nolan slowed. Easy. Rook pressed his nose along the floor, then stopped at a narrow crack behind the tank. The dog pawed once at the stone and looked up. Nolan crouched. Warm air pushed through the gap in uneven breaths. He fitted the filter over the crack, sealed 3 edges, and left the upper corner open to prevent pressure from forcing smoke through another seam. Then he packed damp soil around the frame and covered it with the fire blanket. The air reading steadied, but did not fall. There had to be another leak. Rook turned toward the collapsed workbench and began sniffing its base. Nolan moved the broken boards aside. Beneath them, a rusted access panel covered the lower section of the shaft. One hinge had warped, leaving a narrow opening. Before Nolan could reach it, a deep boom rolled through the mountain. The sound came from far outside, but the stone carried it cleanly. Nolan froze. For a moment the cave vanished. Heat became desert heat. Smoke became dust. The distant explosion became something closer, older, lodged beneath his ribs. His breathing shortened. His right hand tightened around the flashlight until his knuckles hurt. Rook stepped into him at once, pressing his full weight against Nolan's leg. The dog looked up steady and unafraid. Nolan placed his palm against Rook's neck, warm fur, slow pulse, stone floor beneath his boots. August in Colorado, not overseas, not then. I'm here, Nolan whispered. Rook held position until Nolan's breathing matched his own. The pressure in Nolan's chest loosened enough for thought to return. He opened the access panel, cleared the debris, and built a second filtered seal. This time the monitor began to drop. 1 point, then 2. When Nolan and Rook returned to the main chamber, Linda looked at the display and released a breath she had been holding. Hank lowered his eyes. You all right? He asked. Nolan knew what Hank had seen in his face. I am now. He did not pretend the moment had not happened. He did not apologize for it either. The cave settled into a strained rhythm. Dean checked the fan every 10 minutes. Linda measured water into cups. Hank taped the remaining filters into reserve panels. Rook moved between them, pausing beside anyone whose breathing grew too fast. For the first time, the people in the cave were not waiting for Nolan to save them. They were helping him keep everyone alive. Then an engine sounded outside. Another followed. Nolan went to the entrance and saw headlights climbing through the smoke. A small convoy stopped near the gate. 6 adults stepped out, coughing and shielding their faces. Warren Cole stood among them, his expensive shirt dark with sweat, silver sunglasses gone. He looked up at the cave he had called worthless. Pride seemed to leave him one breath at a time. Nolan, he called. The west road is closed. He glanced at the people behind him. We have nowhere else. Nolan studied the 6 figures below the cave. Smoke rolled behind them in gray sheets, flattening the valley into shapes without edges. Warren stood at the front, one hand braced against the hood of a dusty SUV. Beside him were Pamela Cole, his older sister, Ruth Bennett, a retired nurse in her late 60s, 2 county road workers, and Eli Mercer, a rancher whose breathing had already turned shallow. Nolan checked the air monitor, then the water log. The cave could hold more people, but comfort was no longer part of the calculation. Air, water, movement, and discipline were. Hank rose from beside the filter fan. You don't owe him anything, he said quietly. Warren heard. His face tightened, but he did not argue. Nolan looked at Hank. This isn't about what I owe him. He opened the barrier and stepped outside with Rook at his side. The heat had grown heavier, pressing through Nolan's shirt. Ash clung to Warren's hair and shoulders. How long has Eli been breathing like that? Nolan asked. Pamela answered first, 20 minutes, maybe more. Nolan moved past Warren without comment and fitted a clean mask over Eli's face. Rook stood close, watching the man's chest rise and fall. Everyone comes in, Nolan said, slowly. No one uses water until Linda records you. Warren looked up at him. After everything I said, Nolan held the door. The smoke doesn't care what you said. Inside, the space changed at once. More bodies meant more heat, more breath, more uncertainty. Linda began writing names and symptoms. Ruth knelt beside Eli and checked his pulse with practiced fingers. Dean watched the battery display. Pamela gathered the newcomers' water bottles and placed them near the supply table. The two road workers remained near the entrance, waiting for direction. Nolan faced the group. We have limited power and limited water. The air is safe now, but that can change. From this point forward, nothing gets used without being logged. One of the road workers frowned. You're in charge? The question carried more anxiety than challenge. Nolan pointed to the monitor, the map, and the battery board. The numbers are in charge. I'm reading them. That answer settled the room better than authority would have. Nolan assigned the new arrivals by skill. Ruth took over basic medical checks. Pamela helped Linda calculate water use. The road workers cleared brush and loose debris from the protected area near the entrance, staying within sight and returning whenever the wind shifted. Warren received the least dramatic task, moving sealed supply bins away from the warmer western wall and helping Dean inspect cable connections. He accepted without protest. After an hour, the cave found a new rhythm. Water moved in measured cups. Air readings were called out every 15 minutes. Ruth coached Eli through slower breaths. Rook moved between the three sections, pausing beside anyone whose tension rose too quickly. Once he sat beside Pamela until she stopped rubbing her hands together. She looked down at him with a small, surprised smile. He notices everything. Nolan tightened a filter frame. Most people do. Dogs just don't pretend not to. Warren waited until the others were occupied before approaching. His voice had lost its polished certainty. I was wrong about you. Nolan kept working. You were wrong about the cave, about both. Nolan finally looked at him. Warren's eyes dropped toward the floor. I made you into a joke because I didn't understand why anyone would choose this. Nolan folded the edge of the filter into place. Not understanding someone isn't the problem. Warren waited. Deciding they deserve less respect because you don't understand them is. The words landed without anger, which made them harder to avoid. Warren nodded once. I'm sorry. Nolan glanced toward Ruth, who was adjusting Eli's mask, then toward Hank, checking the fan intake. An apology matters when it changes how you treat the next person, not only the person who just let you through the door. Warren absorbed that in silence, then returned to Dean and asked what needed doing. Near dusk, Mara's voice broke through the radio in fragments. The northern fire line had jumped a service road. Both routes down from the ridge were now closed. Rescue crews could not reach the cave before morning. Nolan asked about the old ventilation outlet. Static filled the pause. Then Mara answered. Thermal imaging shows the fire moving toward the upper shaft. Nolan looked toward the western corridor. If flames reached that vent, hot smoke would pour directly into the cave. The people around him had only just begun to breathe easier. He did not tell them everything at once. He checked the monitor, then the map. Rook followed his gaze toward the dark passage behind the concrete tank. The dog stood and moved to the same hidden seam he had found on the first day. Cool air still breathed through it. Nolan knelt beside him and pressed his hand to the stone. Somewhere beyond that wall, the mountain was offering another path. Nolan pressed his palm against the seam behind the concrete tank. The air there felt cooler than the rest of the cave, steady rather than accidental. Rook stood beside him, nose almost touching the stone, ears forward. There's space back there, Nolan said. Dean brought the old project sketch, while Pamela held a lantern close to the faded lines. The drawing showed the tank, the west shaft, and a narrow service corridor that ended beyond the wall. Part of the page had been torn away, but a penciled arrow pointed north. Warren leaned over Nolan's shoulder. You think there's another exit? I think someone designed one, Nolan said. That doesn't mean it still exists. They moved carefully. No one struck the stone or forced the tank. Nolan examined the frame around it and found 4 corroded bolts hidden under mineral buildup. The tank had not been poured against the wall. It had been mounted in front of an access panel. Dean sprayed the bolts with lubricant. Warren and the road workers used hand tools to loosen them a quarter turn at a time. The metal complained in low groans, each sound carrying through the cave. Rook never left the seam. When the final bolt released, the tank shifted less than an inch. Cool air rushed through the gap. It smelled of wet stone, clean earth, and something older than the smoke outside. Nolan checked the air before allowing anyone closer. Oxygen normal, no carbon monoxide. Carbon dioxide slightly higher, but within a workable range. They used a short steel bar as a lever and moved the tank just far enough to reveal a narrow opening. Nolan entered first with Rook on a lead. The passage descended several feet, then widened into a second chamber. His headlamp swept across dry limestone walls. Rusted shelves, a hand pump, and a shallow stone basin filled by a thin stream of groundwater. At the far end stood an iron door coated in reddish scale. Above it, a natural crack climbed toward the northern side of the mountain. Rook walked to the crack and lifted his nose. Fresh air moved through his coat. Nolan felt something inside him loosen, not relief. Relief came too early and made people careless. This was possibility. He returned to the main chamber and explained what he had found. The water is not safe until we treat it. The iron door may lead outside, but we don't know what's behind it. We test everything. Ruth nodded, and we keep the sickest people near the cleanest air. Nolan assigned new tasks. Pamela calculated how much groundwater they could filter without draining the basin too quickly. Dean inspected the hand pump and found the seals dry but intact. Hank heated a small sample while Linda prepared purification tablets. Gavin Holt had not arrived yet, but Nolan wished for someone with laboratory training. Instead, he relied on field methods: filter, disinfect, boil, observe. No shortcuts. The first treated sample came out clear. Nolan tasted only a small amount and waited. It had a mineral edge but no odor. Emergency use only, he said, until we know more. Warren and the road workers turned to the iron door. They removed loose rust, checked the hinges, and worked the latch slowly. The door opened inward with a long scrape. Behind it lay a narrow tunnel choked with roots, fallen soil, and the lower branches of a dead juniper. Daylight showed through a gap no wider than a hand. The exit was blocked but not buried. "We can clear it," Warren said. Nolan looked at the smoke-darkened light beyond the crack. Only from inside and only in shifts. The group worked without rushing. Every few minutes, someone stopped to check the air. Rook moved between the new chamber and the main cave, learning the route faster than any person. When the opening widened, a stream of cool northern air entered. The main chamber's temperature dropped 2 degrees. The carbon monoxide reading fell with it. For the first time since the fire changed direction, the cave breathed without relying entirely on the electric fan. Near the old shelves, Nolan found a metal box sealed with a warped leather strap. Inside were construction notes, inspection dates, and a letter signed by a man named Everett Vale, dated 1976. Everett had planned to turn the cave into an emergency shelter for Juniper Ridge. He had installed the water basin, secondary exit, and passive ventilation, but county funding disappeared before the project was finished. Several handwritten comments in the margin called the idea excessive, unnecessary, and embarrassing for the town. Nolan read the final line twice. One day they may understand that preparation is not fear. It is responsibility. Warren stood beside him, silent. The words seemed to settle between them without needing explanation. Then Rook barked from the main entrance. One bark, pause, 2 more. Nolan hurried back. Through the smoke below, headlights moved up the mountain road in a long, uneven line. More vehicles than the cave had yet received. Linda counted at least 7. Dozens of adults were following the glow from Nolan's solar lamps. The second chamber had given them air, water, and another exit. It had also made the cave the only visible refuge left on the ridge. Nolan looked at the growing line of people and understood the next problem. The question was no longer whether the cave could save them. It was whether they could organize enough space, air, and trust to save everyone without turning fear against itself. The first vehicle stopped 20 yards below the cave, then another pulled in behind it, followed by 5 more through the smoke. Doors opened. Adults stepped out coughing, carrying backpacks, blankets, water jugs, and whatever they had managed to grab before the roads closed. Some looked exhausted. Others looked frightened enough to mistake movement for progress. A few started uphill at once. Nolan stepped outside with Rook at his side and raised one hand. "Stop there, please." The group hesitated. A broad-shouldered man in a soot-stained work jacket kept climbing. "We can see the lights," he said. "We know people are inside." "They are," Nolan answered. "And we need to bring you in without making the air unsafe for everyone." The man's expression hardened. "You don't own the mountain." "I own the property," Nolan said calmly. "But that isn't why I'm asking you to wait." He held up the air monitor. "This is." Rook stood quietly beside him, not threatening, simply present. The dog's steadiness seemed to slow the people nearest the trail. Nolan counted 23 adults. Several had masks. 2 were breathing poorly. One woman leaned heavily against the side of a truck, eyes watering from the smoke. Nolan called Ruth forward. Medical priority first. Ruth and Pamela guided the woman and another man toward the main chamber. Linda began recording names. Warren and the road workers formed a line along the path, spacing people so no one crowded the entrance. The broad-shouldered man folded his arms. "Who decided you get to choose?" "No one chooses who matters," Nolan said. "We choose where people go based on air, health, and space." "That sounds like the same thing." Nolan handed him the monitor. "Read the number." The man glanced at it, 28 parts per million. "Now walk 5 steps toward the western wall." He did. The number rose. Nolan pointed toward the newly opened northern chamber. "That area is cleaner but smaller. People with breathing problems go there first. Healthy adults help prepare the rear shelter." The man looked at the device again. His posture changed by a fraction. "I'm Gavin Holt," he said. "I taught high school science for 22 years. Then I need you checking air quality." Gavin looked surprised. Nolan handed him a notebook, readings every 10 minutes. "If any zone rises too fast, tell me before anyone panics." The challenge left Gavin's face. He nodded and went to work. Nolan divided the cave into 3 areas. The inner chamber held those most affected by smoke. The main chamber housed people who remained stable but needed filtered air. The northern passage became a temporary shelter for healthier adults who could assist with ventilation, water, and supplies. No one received a better place because of money, reputation, or friendship. Everyone received the place their condition required. At first, the cave filled with overlapping voices. People asked about the fire, rescue crews, water, vehicles, pets left behind, and roads that might reopen. Nolan answered only what he knew. "The northern route is closed. Mara is still in contact. We have treated water, but not enough to waste. No one leaves alone." The rules gave fear edges. Once fear had edges, people could work around it. Gavin organized the air log. Pamela recalculated water for 34 adults. Dean showed 2 newcomers how to monitor the batteries. Hank distributed masks. Ruth checked breathing and pulse rates. Warren guided people through the rear passage, speaking with a patience Nolan had not heard from him before. Rook moved between all 3 zones, pausing when someone's breathing became rapid. He sat beside an older rancher until the man matched his breaths to the dog's slow rhythm. By late evening, the cave no longer felt crowded in the same way. It felt arranged. Then the wind changed. Smoke pushed through the upper shaft and curled around the entrance at the same time. Gavin called out the readings. Main chamber rising. West corridor rising faster. Dean checked the fan. The motor gave a strained whine, shuddered, and stopped. Silence followed. Not true silence. People were still breathing. The fire still moved outside, and ash still brushed the stone. But every person in the cave heard the absence of the fan. Dean opened the housing and touched the casing. "Overheated," he said. "It won't restart safely." Nolan looked at the ventilation map. Without the fan, the main chamber would become unsafe within an hour. Then he noticed the old steel ducts drawn above the western shaft. Everett Vale had designed a passive system, one that used rising heat instead of electricity. A damper controlled it from outside. The mechanism sat higher on the ridge, close to the advancing fire line. Nolan placed a hand on Rook's shoulder. The cave had given them a second chamber, another exit, and water. Now it demanded something in return. Trust in a forgotten design and the discipline to reach it without turning courage into recklessness. Nolan studied Everett Vale's faded diagram under the lantern. The passive ventilation system was simple in principle. Warm air rose through the upper steel shaft, drawing cooler air through the northern opening. No motor, no battery, no moving parts except one exterior damper that had to remain open. According to the drawing, the control arm sat 50 yards above the cave on a narrow shelf of rock. Gavin read the latest numbers aloud. 34 in the main chamber, 41 near the west corridor. Still survivable, but climbing. Nolan traced the safest route with one finger. "We don't rush this," he said. "We move only while the wind holds east." Mara's voice came through the radio, broken by static. She had reached the northern service trail in a county utility vehicle, but could not drive closer because of fallen branches. "I can meet you at the rear exit," she said. "Thermal imaging shows no active flame on the north face, but embers are crossing the ridge." Nolan looked around the chamber. Everyone was watching him, waiting for certainty he did not have. He gave them something better. "We have a plan, a route, and a reason to stop if conditions change." Warren stepped forward. "I'm coming," Nolan almost refused. Warren saw it. "I know the upper shelf," he said. "I showed that property to buyers years ago. There's a service cut behind the junipers." Nolan considered the map, then nodded. "You follow instructions. No improvising." Warren accepted the terms without pride. Nolan secured a filtered mask, radio, weather meter, fire blanket, and safety line. Rook wore a protective harness and remained clipped to Nolan's belt. They left through the northern opening, where the air felt cooler but carried the bitter scent of burning bark. Mara waited near the service trail, her face streaked with ash beneath her goggles. "Wind gives us 20 minutes, she said. "Maybe less." The four moved uphill in single file. Rook led only as far as Nolan allowed, testing the ground and air before each bend. The mountain looked unfamiliar under the copper sky. Smoke erased the valley, and falling ash settled over the rocks like gray flour. Halfway to the shelf, Rook stopped so abruptly Nolan nearly stepped into him. The dog lowered his head and refused the direct path. Warren pointed ahead. "That's the shortest way." Nolan crouched and touched the soil. Heat rose through his glove. Beneath a thin crust of dirt, roots were smoldering underground. "We go around." They took the longer route, behind a granite outcrop. Minutes later, a dead pine cracked and fell across the trail they had avoided. Warren stared at the trunk, then at Rook. He knew. He paid attention, Nolan said. "That's not the same as magic." They reached the upper shaft, with the wind already strengthening. The steel vent stood 6 feet high, half hidden by scrub. Its damper arm had rusted shut beneath a nest of dry twigs and windblown debris. Mara sprayed the surrounding brush with water from her pack, while Nolan cleared the debris by hand. Warren held the light steady. The metal arm would not move. Nolan examined the hinge rather than forcing it. A bent retaining pin had locked the mechanism under pressure. "If we pull harder, we break the shaft," he said. "Can you straighten it?" Warren asked. "Not while it's loaded." They wrapped the safety line around the arm and used a short steel bar as a lever, easing the weight off the pin a fraction at a time. Mara watched the wind meter. 12 minutes. Nolan's hands remained steady, though his pulse had begun to climb. He removed the damaged pin, replaced it with a bolt from his repair kit, then signaled Warren to lower the arm slowly. The damper opened with a deep metallic groan. Warm air rushed upward through the shaft. Nolan felt the pull immediately. Back in the cave, Gavin's voice came over the radio. "Readings are dropping. Main chamber down 3 points." A quiet breath passed through the group on the ridge. Then Mara looked south. The smoke had thickened, and sparks moved within it like red insects. "We leave now." They turned back. Warren paused only once, looking toward the blackened slope below. "I thought you were hiding from life up here," he said. Nolan kept walking. "I came here for quiet. That isn't what I meant." Nolan glanced at him. Warren's face held no mockery now, only shame stripped of performance. "I laughed because your choice made mine feel less certain," Warren said. "So I decided yours had to be wrong." Nolan tightened Rook's lead as they descended. "Not understanding someone doesn't give you the right to make them smaller." Warren nodded. "I know that now. Then remember it when nobody is watching." They reached the rear opening as the wind shifted. Inside, the cave had changed. Air moved through it with a low, steady breath. Gavin reported the carbon monoxide level had fallen into the safe range. Dean had shut down the overheated fan, preserving the remaining battery. Nolan counted every person, checked every zone, then sealed the rear screen against embers. Outside, the fire swept across the upper ridge without entering the cave. No one cheered. The sound was too large for celebration. They sat together in the dim light. listening to the ventilation system work exactly as Everett Vale had designed it nearly 50 years earlier. Rook rested his head on Nolan's knee. Nolan placed a hand on the dog's neck and felt the tension slowly leave them both. For years he had believed safety meant distance from people. Now more than 30 adults trusted the same stone walls, the same measured air, and one another. The cave had not held because Nolan was stronger than the fire. It held because knowledge replaced panic, preparation replaced pride, and every person accepted that survival was shared work. Morning arrived without sunlight. Smoke still covered Juniper Ridge, but the air inside the cave had cleared enough for people to remove their masks in short intervals. The passive ventilation shaft pulled steadily, drawing cool air through the northern opening and carrying heat upward through the old steel pipe. Nolan checked the monitor twice before he trusted the numbers. Safe, stable, holding. Rook stood beside him at the rear exit, ears lifted toward a distant mechanical hum. At first, Nolan thought it was wind moving through damaged trees. Then Mara raised her radio. "Rescue convoy is coming up the North Service Road." Nobody cheered immediately. They had spent too many hours learning that good news needed confirmation. A few minutes later, amber lights appeared through the haze. County trucks, medical units, and fire crews moved slowly along the blackened ridge. Nolan opened the rear gate and began sending people out according to Ruth's medical list. Those with breathing trouble went first, then the exhausted, then everyone else. No one pushed, no one argued about order. The habits formed inside the cave held even after the danger began to pass. Hank stopped beside Nolan before leaving. His face looked older than it had 2 days earlier. "I called this place a hole," he said. Nolan glanced at the stone walls. "It was a hole until people gave it purpose." Hank nodded, accepting the correction without defending himself. Warren remained until the final group had been counted. He helped Dean carry the battery cases outside, then returned for the water logs and Everett Vale's metal box. When he handed the box to Nolan, he held it carefully, as though it contained more than paper. "The town should know his name," Warren said. "Yes," Nolan replied, "but not as a man they ignored until he proved useful." Warren looked toward the people gathering near the rescue vehicles. "As a man they should have respected before that." Nolan gave a small nod. That was enough. Local reporters arrived by afternoon. They wanted a simple story: a war veteran, a heroic dog, a hidden cave, and 34 lives saved. Nolan refused the version built around one man. He gave them names instead. Mara had provided the fire data. Ruth had managed medical care. Dean had protected the power system. Linda and Pamela had controlled supplies. Gavin had tracked air quality. Hank had built filters. Warren and the road workers had cleared the northern exit. Rook had detected smoke, unstable ground, and people in distress before anyone else. "The cave did not save this town by itself," Nolan told the camera. "Stone gave us shelter. People made it work." The sentence spread farther than he expected. Within weeks, county officials offered to purchase the property and convert the cave into a public emergency facility. Nolan declined the sale, but agreed to a permanent access agreement. The cave would remain his home while its outer chambers became a certified community shelter. His conditions were simple: free preparedness training, annual ventilation inspections, water testing, support plans for residents living alone, and no promotional campaign that reduced veterans to symbols. Rook would be listed as part of the emergency response team, not as a mascot. Autumn rains came late, washing ash from the rocks and uncovering thin green shoots beneath the burned brush. Workers reinforced the northern exit, repaired Everett Vale's ventilation system, and installed new air sensors without erasing the original structure. Nolan kept the old project sign. Beside it, the town placed a second plaque bearing Everett's name and the line found in his letter: "Preparation is not fear, it is responsibility." Warren began volunteering at the monthly safety workshops. He never tried to turn his apology into a performance. He carried water containers, checked smoke alarms, and listened when others spoke. Nolan respected that more than any public speech. On the first Saturday after the shelter opened, a group of residents climbed the ridge for training. They came from different neighborhoods, jobs, and income levels. Some had once laughed. Others had stayed silent when they should have spoken. Nolan met them at the entrance with Rook beside him. A new wooden sign stood near the path: Juniper Ridge Shelter, preparedness, dignity. No one left behind. Rook looked up the trail as the visitors approached. Nolan rested a hand on the dog's neck. Months earlier, he had bought the cave because stone felt easier than people. Now voices filled the chamber without tightening his chest. He still valued quiet. He simply no longer confused quiet with safety or isolation with peace. Warren reached the entrance carrying a box of filters. "Ready?" he asked. Nolan looked into the cave, then at the people waiting outside. "Open the doors," he said. Rook stepped forward first. The mountain had not changed its judgment of Nolan. Mountains did not judge. People did. And people, when given truth, responsibility, and the chance to do better, could change. Which moment in Nolan and Rook's journey stayed with you most? Like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.